Hi there, welcome to this lecture looking at the functionalist view of the role of the family. And in particular, we're going to be focused on the views of Murdock in today's lecture. As we go through this lecture and others, I'd like you to keep a lookout for this symbol, a yellow star, normally with a G in the middle of it. It means you need to add a new concept to your glossary. Perhaps that could be at the back of your notebook. You could write glossary, or on an A4 bit of paper. You could either create a table, or if it's a lined bit of paper, you can use the margin. That'd be quite useful. So just a heads up, in this lecture, the key words you'll be learning about are nuclear family, deviant, monogamous, and dark side of the family. So make sure you've got space for those in your glossary. And we'll be adding to that glossary as we move through this part of the course. So functionalists favour the nuclear family, which we talked about in an introduction to family lecture. Just to remind you, and in case you haven't got this, please add this definition to your glossary. So the nuclear family is male and female parents who are married, living with their children, which are either their own or adopted. Okay, so that's a more modern definition of nuclear family. So the nuclear family is seen as the ideal or best family type, the type that everybody seems to want to be in when they grow up. And generally, the nuclear family is viewed as having typical gender roles within it, and that's a good thing, particularly if you're a functionalist. So when we say gender roles, that's the sort of behaviour you'd expect from someone based on their gender. So male behaviour versus female behaviour. And in the context of a family, the typical male behaviour would be breadwinner. So he will go out and he will earn the money for the family. He might come home and do some sort of physical manual jobs around the house, but very little housework generally. The female gender role is sort of the housewife role, the carer, the mother figure, not really the earning money role. Okay, so they've got two separate gender roles, and that's what functionalists prefer. This family type, the nuclear family type, is seen as the norm pretty much in today's society still. And this is generally because agents of socialization like the media, politicians, even religion, and even education, I'd argue, sort of socialize us into believing this to be true. We sort of see this message repeatedly that, the nuclear family is the best family type. It's the family type that we all want to grow up and be members of. Okay, so if you think about, I always think about movies as a good place to start. So I think about Disney movies. It's only very recently that in Disney movies we started to see different family types, but most of them, it's the romantic idea is, the man and the woman, and they have their children together, and that's very happy. That's the idea of happiness. That's the happy ending. We see it in adverts. So if you watch any adverts for holidays, not that many of us are going on them, you will probably see a nuclear family in those adverts, for example. So we all kind of end up believing this to be the best family type. Look how happy they are in those adverts. Sometimes this is called a cereal packet family, because when you see adverts for cereal randomly, quite often they use the nuclear family, a man, a woman who are married with their biological children. Feminists are quite critical of the idea of the nuclear family. They would say that it's not the only family type, and actually they would argue it's not even the best family type, as they believe other family types are just as functional, so just as good for society and the members of that family. In particular, they argue that lone parent families can be just as good or better in some cases. Now, lone parent families we talked about last lecture. You can add that to your glossary if you want. Just to remind you that a lone parent is a man or a woman who is raising a dependent child. Their partner, their husband or wife, has either died perhaps, or they've been separated through a divorce perhaps. Okay, that's a lone parent family. And the feminist, so feminists would actually say, lone parent families can be better in some cases, particularly if perhaps the family, man and woman in the family argued all the time, or they're fighting, actually separating and growing up in a lone parent family where there's not that conflict can actually be much better for the children and, of course, the man or woman or both who have separated. Anne Oakley, who is a feminist, she also argued that the nuclear family is only one of many family types in today's society. So what I'd like you to do in your notes is, can you list 2 alternative families that are really common in the UK today? You're not allowed to use lone parent families because I've given you that one. So can you think of 2 other family types that are really common in the UK today, apart from lone parent and obviously apart from nuclear? So yeah, feminists are a bit critical of the nuclear family. But today's lecture, like I said, we're going to be focusing on the functionalist view, and in particular George Murdock's view. So Murdock's definition of family is a group consisting of adults of both sexes. The adults are in a sexual relationship with one or more children of the couple. They share resources and live together. So he's developed it slightly from the nuclear family definition I've given you, because he's mentioned that it's really important that they're in a sexual relationship. Okay, and it's important, he's mentioned that kind of share resources and live together. So by sharing resources, he's really getting at, I think, economic resources there. So money, housing, food, and living together. So Murdock argued that families are essential for society to survive. And what he meant by that is that without families, society would completely fall apart. Okay, so he thinks families are one of the most important institutions in society. So at this point, I'd like you to have a think, and I'd like to pause the lecture for maybe a minute or 2 and have a think about these 2 questions. What functions does the family provide for wider society? So what things that go on outside family. What does the family provide for wider society? And then have a think, what functions does the family provide for its members? So think like, the mum and dad, the children. What does the family do for its members? So have a pause and have a think about those 2 questions. So hopefully you've got some ideas down and you did pause it. And I'll just nip through some of the points that Murdock said. So he said essentially the family has 4 key functions. So in terms of what it does for wider society, he said the family socializes children into shared norms and values. So the family is really important in teaching children how to behave, norms, and what things are important to aim for, values. So this means that society works in harmony. If you all share the same norms and values, it means we're all going in roughly the same direction and there's less conflict between us. He also said a key function of the family is biological reproduction. Okay, he said it's really important that families do actually create the next generation of workers for the economy, because if families stop having children, eventually we're going to run out of people to work in, factories, in businesses, in offices, in the service industry, and we won't have any money effectively to kind of run the rest of society. So we need workers. The other aspect was, what functions does the family provide for members? And Murdock identified 2 key ones. He said, 3 different ones, apologies. He said emotional support. So this is kind of like emotional support and a little bit of socialization from both gender parents, okay? Now, he believed it was really important, and functionalists all believe that it's really important to have the gender roles of each gender in parents for a balanced socialization. Okay, so they believe that boys and girls both need to be socialized by a male gender role and a female gender role. And the family should provide emotional support for the members. He also argued that another really important aspect was economic support. So families should have 2 incomes, and they can use those incomes to pay for food, shelter, clothing, cars, holidays. The family should be responsible for looking after the economic well-being, so the money stuff, for all the members. And the third one is satisfaction of sex drive in a stable monogamous relationship. So you guys might be like, what? But Murdock said this is really important. He said, look, a couple needs to satisfy each other's sex drive in a monogamous relationship. So I'd like you to add monogamous to your glossary. So mono, that what means one, and monogamous equals 2 people staying faithful to one another. So if you have a couple, a man and a woman, who are in a stable relationship and are satisfied sexually with one another, it means that they will not, if you like, go off and have sex with other people, which would break down the family. So by being satisfied sexually with one another, it stops families breaking down, and it keeps the family institution much more stable. And that's really important to functionalists. The family should stay together no matter what. They're a big fan of the family. So how can we evaluate Murdock's view of the family? So what I'm asking you to think about there is, how can we criticise his view of the family? And there are three main criticisms. The first one is that he doesn't include more modern family types. So we have a lot more lone parent families these days, a lot more same-sex couples. We have other family types like reconstituted families. We have divorced extended families. We have extended families. So he's not really taking into account how families have changed over time. But interestingly, Murdock doesn't even take into account the huge number of lone parent families that were created following World War II back in the 1940s. So his definition doesn't even include, many of the war widows that are left behind with their children, which I think is quite unfair. Secondly, I've already mentioned that feminists are a bit critical of the functionalist view of the family. So they would say that Murdock and functionalists generally ignore what's known as the dark side of family life, in particular nuclear family. And this is another word or term to add to your glossary, dark side. So what I mean by that is that in many families, sadly, there is, domestic violence towards family members, whether that be towards the children or towards other adults in the house, predominantly men against women, sadly. But it's more than that. Feminists also say the dark side is also the exploitation of women within the family. So they point out, that women, as that image in the corner indicates, they do so many household chores. They raise kids, they clean, they juggle shopping lists, they make sure everyone's got the right equipment for school, they make sure the birthday cards get sent. And on top of that, women also now work. That's the norm. Women work. So that's what feminists say, that's pretty exploitative for women, and it's quite stressful. And they say that, people like Murdock ignore how stressful that can be for women, which can put a lot of pressure on them, both mentally and physically. The final evaluation of Murdock's view is that he argued that the family was completely essential. It was the only institution that could do the things that it does. Whereas there's an argument that other social institutions have taken over some of these key roles of the family. So I've given you a list there of some of the key roles of the family. So the economic support to provide food and shelter, financial support, socialization into norms and values, and reproduction of children. Can you think of other institutions that have perhaps taken over some of these key roles of the family? Is there anything else in society that, for example, could provide food or shelter if you didn't have your families to look after you? Is there anything else? Likewise, if financial support, if you lost your job or you didn't have, wanted to go to uni and you couldn't afford it, if your family aren't going to support you, where else could you get that financial support? So maybe you could write down some notes. This is an interesting one. What about socialization into norms and values? Is there any other institutions that are really important, perhaps more important in some cases, in teaching you guys the right and wrong ways to behave, the things to find important? Or is there an agent of socialization that's perhaps doing this in a quite bad way? Yeah, and can you think of any institutions that have taken over the reproduction of children? I'll be honest, I can't think of any. I think reproduction of children is predominantly still done within the family unit, not necessarily between married couples, as we talked about in last lecture. So hopefully some of you guessed some of these ideas. So I've made a note of social services very much help out with, benefits, childcare arrangements if there's not a balanced kind of home life. Financial support, things like benefits. You can get housing benefit from the government. You can get unemployment benefit. You can get student loans from the government, for example. In terms of socialisation, I made the point there of education and schools. I think you learn a lot of key lessons about how to behave, the value consensus in schools. And I've also made the point about the media, and I've taken that's a headline from an Australian newspaper. When the Australian cricket team was caught cheating, the media published so many news stories about how awful they were and really shamed them. And I think that's important to remember, that the media's a big agent that reminds us how to behave. It basically reminded everyone, don't cheat because, it's really awful. And if you look at our media, I think they do the same thing. They kind of teach us right from wrong. Although sometimes the risk is that some newspapers are a little bit unfair. Okay. And like I said, reproduction of children, I think that's predominantly done within families. Okay. So if all these other institutions can do what the family can, then actually the family isn't essential anymore, which was Murdock's big argument. He said they are essential. Okay. But I just want to end on this point here. Yes, all these other institutions can do what the family does, apart from reproduction of children. But let's face it, isn't it true that the family is better at doing all of those things at once rather than having to rely on lots of different organisations such as education, social services, the government and what have you? Like, the family just seems to be a slightly simpler solution to all those different needs. So if you can get down those evaluation points, that would be fantastic. So to summarise what we've learnt today, the functionalists favour the nuclear family. They see it as much more functional for members and for society for various reasons. Murdock defined the family as two members of the opposite sex in a sexual relationship with their biological children. And he argued that the family had four key functions: satisfaction of sex drive, reproduction of workers, socialisation of children, and meeting members' economic and emotional needs. Okay, so there are four key functions. But Murdock ignores that other family types exist, that other institutions have taken on some of the essential roles of the family, and that the family has a dark side, which was a feminist criticism. Okay, guys, thank you for listening. Speak to you soon.